Let's just move on to our second point. You said in one of your answers that the financial crisis has led to the rise in populism, and I want to link that now to the latest incarnation, the latest manifestation of discontent. Here in France, we see the movement of the gilets jaunes. From where you are in the UK, how is this movement being perceived, and what does it say about the ability of representative democracy to respond to and deal with these kind of leaderless movements?
It is getting some space in our broadcasts and discussions. It's not getting as much as it should do, and the significance of what comes from it, which is going to be A, fascinating from a sociological point of view, but B, also concerning about whichever direction it will take. And that's mainly because the UK is so wrapped up in its own British exceptionalism around Brexit, which we have to acknowledge that there's been no other discussions beyond Brexit. This is a fascinating story emerging. It highlights the dissatisfaction with the political, economic, cultural structures within society. It is also seen as understanding that movements are, as the sociologist Tilly once said, which is social movements are not these neat, organized boxes of action, but they are incredibly messy and complex, and they are fluctuating and moving in all different directions at the same time. So this is a reminder of the fragility and delicacy to actually create discussion and create debate and create reaction to these contemporary issues that we're highlighting. The problem is, and again, this goes back to the point I made before, is that you can see that, as somebody in the UK who's looking at these stories, you can see how the different competing agendas are coming into the space within what's happening around this kind of resistance movement, and not all of it will be focused on the initial ideas as to what this movement wanted to try to create or wanted to try to highlight. Now that is deeply worrying, and this goes back to the point I made before, because there will be certain fractions within that group, within those social movements, that have a clear vision, and that it is one built on ideals which are deeply uncomfortable with other groups who may even be occupying those spaces. And this then becomes further problematized because it linked into what you talked about before, which is no coherent leadership. Now that doesn't mean that there are no leaders in those groups. There are leaders in the groups, but what they are soft leadership positions, whereby there is a leadership, but nobody really recognizes there's a leadership. But there are certain key influential figures and groups within that structure and within the organization. Now the question then becomes: what is it that those organizations, those soft leadership organizations and soft leadership individuals, what is it that they're trying to achieve with this movement? And that will be the basis of what happens next. Now the response, from what I've seen, the response has been fairly underwhelming. There has been no significant recognition as to why this sort of resistance has emerged. There doesn't appear, you can tell me if I'm wrong, there doesn't appear to be any attempt to collaborate or engage with the ideas and issues that are coming out of these resistance movements. Now, I certainly don't condone any sort of violence or aggression. And the reason I say that is because once you start to engage in those tactics, you then start to lose the space of debate and discussion and trying to highlight what it is that you're trying to highlight. And this is reflected in the messiness of trying to understand what it is that these kind of key demands and key issues emerging, because they seem to be fluctuating and pulling in different directions depending on who you're talking to. So the tactics that are being used are are reflective of the different demands and different agendas that are trying to engage in this space. And it is very unpredictable as to what may happen next. But the importance of that is to recognize that actually many social movements are unpredictable in their cycle of life, and also to consider how it is that the clear ideas and agendas will emerge, but equally it also depends on how the state or how those groups respond to them as well. And what I don't want to see is a them and us culture continuing. I want to see some sort of opportunity to debate and discuss between the different stakeholders involved in this process, of which there will be people in those social movements and within those protest groups that do want to discuss and highlight. They want to highlight the issues that they are trying to get traction and try to get coverage on. But there will also be an opportunity to say, well, can we now pursue this sort of direction of travel in order to address the concerns and address the issues? But there is a clear underlying feeling of extreme anger and discontent. And anger and discontent is fine, but when the rationale for the anger or discontent, or when the ideas to address such issues rest upon hostility or rest upon the issue of trying to marginalize certain groups of people within society, that will cause further problems. And it's deeply worrying.
I think when I look at this movement, one of the first things that jumps out at me is that it seems to be a movement of both the left and the right when you look at the things that they're asking for. So that complicates things enormously. Secondly, the tactics of street demonstrations and immobilizing roadways are exactly the tactics necessary to get the attention of governments. Peaceful discussions in the salons of Paris or Marseille or Strasbourg or the big cities, Lille, that wouldn't have brought President Macron and others to the negotiating table. Also, representative democracy seems to me to have a difficulty. How does it negotiate with leaderless movements who represent so many different factions, as you've mentioned? But also, how does it buy off these various movements when the money is clearly run out?
Well, the money hasn't run out. It's being spent on different areas, on certain things, and prioritizing certain things over others. Just to go back to the first point, the significance. So just to clarify what I said before, the tactics that are being used, you need direct action, you need protest, you need to bring things to a standstill. And I absolutely agree with those tactics. I'm more concerned with how, if you have tactics around creating fires, trying to create violence in terms of trying to challenge certain groups or to try to engage in fights. Now, people will say, well, actually, if you've been so marginalized, this is your reaction. The problem is that actually that distracts away from what it is that we're trying to debate and discuss. And you also need to remember that if your problem is with the state, well, the state has many more resources to suppress and close down any form of resistance. So if you engage in those kind of issues, you give the state and you give the authorities legitimacy to go even further in their attempt to suppress and to disrupt the protesting and the resistance movements. So that's just what I just want to say on that. Now, the problem is, and this goes back to the point, I agree completely with you in terms of the importance of using technologies in order to get people engaged and bringing people together. But this is the problem. If you're engaged, if you don't necessarily have a clear and coherent argument as to what it is you're trying to resist and what it is that you're trying to offer as a solution going forwards, even if it is just wide or abstract, and there's no necessarily problem with abstract ideas and thoughts, but you need to have some sort of direction as to what you want changing and how it can be changed from the perspective of the richness of information and experiences of those people who are part of that social movement. So, and this is being seen now because you have different people coming forward, you have different arguments being put forward, and there is no coherent strategy to say this is what it is that we're highlighting, and this is the vision that we want to create change. But you've also got to recognize as well as this is further problematized because you have in France a centrist government, which people aren't entirely clear. And you again, I'm not an expert in the French political system, but I'm not entirely clear what Macron stands for or what the current government stands for. And this is why you had many academics who, some of them that I agree with and some of them I don't, but I agree with them on the point they made, which was to say a vote for Macron now will lead to a vote for nationalist parties in the next election cycle. Because when you ask people why you voted for Macron, you got such different ideas that the reality will be that there'll be many people who are dissatisfied with the current government because the government was trying to appease too many different people. And this goes back to the points we made before in the previous podcast around the death of centrist parties. It's because people have no idea what they stand for. At least you can reject a left-wing agenda, or you can reject a right-wing party on the basis of their ideas. But the problem is that the centre doesn't really stand for anything. It tries to engage with these various different groups. And this is why you've had a cycle of many years of reducing numbers of people voting for such parties who are then saying, well, you're all just the same, you all say the same things, just slightly differently. And so what is happening in France has to also be understood within the context of a centrist government in France, which doesn't have a clear mandate for why it was elected for the people in France.
I think there's clearly a personal drama that's taking place. We have a president who was elected to signal the end of politics as usual. And now he's confronted by a protest movement which says that he has been captured by the establishment. He has been captured by those who wish to perpetuate politics as usual. So there's a personal drama there.
Well, that's interesting but from my point of view, when I saw him getting popularity, I thought this would be business as usual within 1 to 2 years. Just in the same way that Hillary Clinton would have been dreadful for American politics as well. People think that Hillary Clinton we would have been in a much better place. Well, you would have been in a much better place compared to, say, Trump, for example. But you wouldn't have done anything to actually address the deep problems with the political systems across the countries that we've been discussing. And this is my problem: is that the safe bets or the safe choices or the steady figures that we try to promote within our political structures are just further cementing the problems, which is to say that there is going to be continual growing dissatisfaction with the system. And because the right have a coherent message ready, again, I think it's simplistic, it's deeply offensive, and it's rooted in hostility and trying to identify the other to justify all your problems. But that narrative is already there. So this is why that if you're picking people like Hillary Clinton, like Macron, like other centrists, centre or people who could be attached to the centre, what you're doing is just perpetuating the problem, and you will then have no surprise that you'll then have this reaction, which typically will fall to the right, who then take over, because people will say, well, I'm dissatisfied, and we needed a complete and utter change. And because the left don't have a vision and a coherent argument, then the change that can only be offered is the one that is most visible, and that happens to be on the right.
All of this does raise the issue of how representative democracies should respond to the patent discontent of the middle class. The middle class, I think I read somewhere, I think it's a famous quote, historically is the only undefeated class. So how can the middle class, with all the rage that you see demonstrated in these protest movements in different parts of Europe, how can representative democracy respond to the demands of this group? Because electorally, it's poison for a president whose ambition is to govern from the centre. as you say, the risk is that these movements polarize politics so that people move either to the left or to the right. How this is really tricky for representative democracy. So how do you see a pathway out of these kinds of crises?
Well, I think a starting point would to recognise that our democracies aren't really that representative compared to the points that we've made before, and the opportunities to engage with these political discussions are not representative of the people that are the current demographics within society. My view, and again, I have to recognise my own biases within this, is to say that I would probably want centre parties to be finished, to be honest, because I think they just perpetuate this problem that we've been discussing, and that have been discussing for many, many years, because I want to see more clear, very different visions on offer so people can actually engage with them as well. And if people are unhappy with the visions that are being offered, then of course that's an opportunity to then engage in debate and dialogue to create the necessary changes. But again, this comes back to my point around how do we ensure that those who are completely detached from this, that actually see the anger and frustration, but don't necessarily want to engage with it, or don't see it as an important issue. That's where the priority should be, of trying to bring those people into the discussion, so that actually those of us who are middle class and engage with our issues of concerns and our problems that we have in our daily lives, we also remember and acknowledge how our demand and agendas also fit in with actually others who are further marginalized in the discussions that we're having. Because the commonality of all what we've been talking about is this experience of marginalization and discrimination. Now, we will have very different experiences of discrimination and marginalization, but the reality is that actually occurs and that happens for people irrespective of who they are, irrespective of what that experience may be. So the question is one that is quite simple, really, is to say, why do we want to put up with this discrimination? Why do we want to put up with this marginalization in whatever form it takes? And can we start to unpick these issues and these deliberate issues that take place that creates and sustains these experiences? And until we start engaging in that, and that's not going to be a quick answer, and it won't be one that actually is addressed within a short-term political cycle of 4 to 5 years. But my goodness, it is desperately needed unless we want to continue down this route of having very much reactionary politics to short-term crises with soundbite answers and celebrities like Tyson Fury being the pinnacle of rationality on these discussions.
I think for me the common thread, certainly of this conversation today and previous ones, is the enduring fragility of representative democracy since the financial crash. It can't seem to find the language or refresh itself with new ideas to respond to the concerns that led to Brexit. It tries to come up with new formulas, so we see Macron arriving as a kind of so-called savior, so-called antidote to politics as usual. We see this being played out in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in different countries, and yet the same old concerns come along. Is this, from your historical point of view, Miro, is this just cyclical? Are we just in that phase where there is a crisis of democracy, and then sooner or later there will be a shakeout and the full vigour of democracy, representative democracy, will be restored? Or do you see, as others now see, that we're reaching the end game and that something new is going to emerge? If there is something new, what do you think that something new will look like? And will it be able to better respond to the needs of people? Because there are so many people who are almost self-selecting out of the current system, and we need, as you've said today and at other times, we need more people to engage with the system. But that's counterintuitive, because they say, well, there's nothing there for me to engage with. The money has run out. You say it's just a question of priorities, but if you look at the evidence, growth, etc., the rise of China, the money is running out. We still seem to be locked into a paradigm where we sponsor those who already have enough money at the expense of those who don't. So the capacity for democracy to reinvigorate itself seems to be less. So what do we do? What's the pathway out of this? Because these contest movements that have emerged, either on the left or the right, have taken place in countries which have been massively impacted by the financial crash. Recently, we're seeing these movements and these concerns, these worries, particularly amongst the middle class, emerge in Britain and France, two countries which have been which didn't take the full impact of the financial crash in the way in which Cyprus, Spain, Portugal did. So what does that tell us, and should we be worried? Many questions there. Pick out from those which ones you wish to reply to.
I would start by saying the current direction is one of complete and utter failure of trying to protect the significance and the importance of issues around social justice. So if we continue, I don't believe in kind of prescriptions of and formulas as to say this will happen eventually and this will lead to this and so on. This is why I'm not a Marxist. Although I see the significance of it as a tool of analysis, but I'm certainly not. I can't agree with such approaches in order to give a clear and precise direction of travel, which is too formulaic. So what I want people to recognize is that there is no suggestion that things will get better. In fact, I can see them getting considerably worse in the way things are at the moment. Now, the reaction to that, I feel, will be one of further individualism and further individual responsibility as a way to justify how things are, and for then us to think about how we then start to try to compete or continue competing against one another. Now, what do we do about this? Well, again, I think it's very easy. I agree. It's very easy for me to say we need to engage with the issues that I've talked about. But until something even remotely tangible to those issues is promoted and celebrated and recognized as being important, then all of this is kind of lost. Because it may make sense for me to say it's important for us to engage with young people. But actually the reality is that many people think, write them off. If they don't want to bother engaging, they don't want to bother engaging. It's very radical for me to say it's important for us to engage with disability politics. Most people, when they talk about disability, they just think it's to do with a problem with your medical background or your health needs, and that's the end of it. They don't see it as a kind of issue of social oppression. So we need this to be actually promoted and presented as clear, articulated messages for people to grasp and engage with. And what I say is actually, those at the top, if you generally want to have change, then how is it that you're actually future-proofing what it is that you're trying to do? And where is the importance of thinking about how we create longevity and sustainability in these ideas? So I'm not going to give a vision as to, you need to do these kind of 3 steps and these issues will be addressed, because nobody can offer you that. But what I'm saying is, on the one hand, we need to have more discussion like this to promote these kind of ideas, which to some people are very radical, although I don't think they are, but they're very radical, and therefore they need to have the space to be explored and considered. They need to be translated into meaningful everyday experiences for people so that they can draw the links between the themes and abstract ideas that we have and linking it to their everyday experience. But we also need to ensure that the things that we're working in as people interested in fairness and social justice, that we have some sort of planning to keep those things continuing once we move out of these spaces. Because we don't spend enough time thinking about the sustainability and longevity of these issues. And what happened is, because you've got all these different activists and campaigners and organizations which are in such precarious situations and rely on one or two or three individuals. And these people are trying to constantly fight against the system because they're trying to demonstrate what is problematic with the system in order to create the change. What happens is it relies on a great individual who dies or gives up or hasn't got the time anymore. Or in the cases of people like me and you, we get brought into various different structures within the system and get nice little positions and we stay there. So what are we doing to actually safeguard the discussions that we're having, the ideas that we're raising, the research and the literature that we come across, as a way to offer that to newcomers to these discussions? And if we focus on that a little bit and think about that importance of archiving our ideas, of making sure they're accessible, making sure they are relatable to people, and that they can be transferred into different contexts for people to own and take ownership of these ideas and discussions, and don't allow them to rest with certain individuals, then we will be able to create the changes required. And we'll be able to see what that change may look like. But until we start to address those kind of three areas that I just discussed then, and not see them as a blueprint, but see them as different avenues that need to be explored, it will depend if we do anything like that. And if we don't, then we will continue with what we have now, and it will become much worse, I feel, because of this over-reliance on individualism, on being driven by the markets, of politics being this particular brand which is not reflective of the needs of individuals, and people don't see themselves represented in these influential positions. And it will be something that we will look back on in 20, 30 years. And the way we discuss disabled people, the way we discuss working class communities, the way we discuss refugees and so on, we'll be pretty ashamed of ourselves.